So let's start our first subsistence strategy type. This is Gen Talk, Making a Living, Subsistence Strategies Part 2, Hunters and Gatherers. So let's talk about our hunters and gatherers and how they make a living. And again, I mentioned that we would go through 8 different key features of these types. First of all, they make a living by hunting animals and gathering vegetables. Very few hunting and gathering societies still exist today. The population that they can maintain within one society is usually about 25 to a maximum of 50 people. And 50 is in areas in which there really is an abundance of animals, and in particular plants that are high in protein and nutrients for human beings. Life chances, or their access to resources, that refers to how easy it is for them to access necessary resources. For hunters and gatherers, all members of the society have an immediate and relatively easy access to all of the same resources, all of the same types of food, animals, tools, homes, etc. They're located in areas where resources are available locally. They're usually tropical and subtropical, so they may be on the outskirts of deserts, but hunters and gatherers would not be successful in desert areas. And while they are not nomadic, they don't always move their homes. They may, over time, pick up and move their homes to another area if migratory behaviors and practices or environmental practices or shifts occur. If a river were to dry up or reroute for some reason to another area after a few years, or if the migratory patterns of animals were to shift after a few years, then they might move their village or their community to another area. But they all live in the same kinds of homes or houses. They use the same tools. They equally distribute the protein that they gather through collecting nuts, which are their primary source of protein, or when they hunt and are successful in killing an animal, everyone gets a piece of the meat as well as the fur and other tools that they can build from that. So they're quite equal or egalitarian in terms of access to resources. With hunters and gatherers, their technology is very simple. The tools that they use to hunt, to gather, and to live are very simple. They are what they each make for themselves out of sticks, rocks, bones, leather that they build, etc. So very simple tools are used for their subsistence, which probably helps in understanding why they can only maintain smaller size societies. In terms of division of labor, women gather with the children and the aged or the elderly. But interestingly, they end up gathering about 70 to 90% of the calories that the community and the families consume. Men do the hunting, and they hunt about 10 to 30% of the calories. Now, there's no money that is exchanged. You collect, you hunt, you bring home what it is you need to eat and survive, and you don't need money, you don't need a job. If you're really successful, you don't have to go to work for a few days. If times are tight, if there isn't as much food out there, if it's not a season in which food is available as readily, then you're going to work every day for many hours of the day. Now, the reason the women gather with the children is because women are also bearing the children. And while they are pregnant and also breastfeeding, they continue working, but they do so with their children with them. So they've sort of figured out that it is easier for them to do that kind of work if they have children than it is to do the hunting kind of work where they have to engage in quick spurts of chasing animals, which is difficult to do with children and the elderly. However, it is highly valued, the work that the gatherers in the society do, because they actually produce most of what they eat and live off of. Now, the one exception to that is the Inuit in the North and Arctic areas of northern Canada and northern Alaska. In those cases, they're also hunting and gathering societies. But as you imagine it, imagine if you are the gatherer. What are you going to gather in the Arctic? Not very much. In those cases, we see a far less egalitarian or equal society between the genders because everything that they need, 99% of it, is obtained through the work of men who do the hunting of whales, seal, and other animals, and they use their meat, their fat for burning oil for candles, and they use their hides for their clothing. The women and the children with the women and the elderly do very little in terms of making a living, so their job is to prepare what the men bring home. So while most hunting and gathering societies, like the Kung San of the Kalahari in Africa and many Native American cultures of the past, are very egalitarian, which means that there's equality between the sexes and the ages, with the Inuit, in fact, they're not very egalitarian at all. Women really live a second-class life to the men who make the living. In terms of quality of life and this notion of surplus or having extra, they work when food is needed. They're dependent completely on the physical environment that they're in. They're mostly egalitarian, and that's what we just talked about. And they value their elderly who know things about hunting, about gathering, about weather patterns, and they value their children because life is rough. And while they are generally happy and satisfied and not frustrated with day-to-day work struggles or interpersonal struggles the way more modern societies are, because life is very simple, all it takes is one hurricane, one major life event within a family, or one major societal impact or environmental impact, and much of a society can be wiped out. So they do value having children. Having said that, they also recognize that they have to be able to do their work with their children. So within hunting and gathering societies, in the Kung San, for example, of the Kalahari Desert, they will breastfeed their children for usually up to about 4 years, because they know that they need to be able to keep them with them while they're gathering the food. And for as long as you're breastfeeding, you don't ovulate, and therefore, while it's not impossible to get pregnant, it's highly unlikely. That allows them to sort of control their fertility so that they can continue to bring home the bacon, so to speak, or bring home the resources that the family needs to live through those gathering activities. In terms of territories and land, with hunters and gatherers, there are no territories. Land ownership is not a concept. The currency is the calories or the food that they consume, and trade is rare. As societies modernized and some hunting and gathering societies became horticulturalists or pastoralists, which we'll talk about in the next section, they would occasionally trade with those groups when they came in contact with them, or possibly with other hunting and gathering groups. But generally, they take care of themselves. They take care of themselves day to day, and they don't even understand the notion of one being able to own the land and drawing lines on land for property. For them, the earth is the earth, and no human being can own that. Finally, in terms of relationships, there are no formal marriages. Children tend to live with their mother until they're adults, so the age of adulthood is much younger, usually around the time of puberty or shortly thereafter, so somewhere between 12 and 15. Families control the procreation by nursing through age 4, as I mentioned before. When there's no surplus of things or land to own, legal marriage is actually unnecessary. Ties to families are fluid and characterized with less conflict, and people experience an equal quality of life. So there's no reason to get formally married, because you don't need to set up an inheritance that will be passed down from one family member to another. Everyone shares in all of the resources that they have. So no one household has more things than another, and therefore some parents don't provide more for their kids than other parents. It's all communal. Therefore, marriage is not necessary, which doesn't mean that they don't have romantic relationships that last a long period of time. They absolutely do. And they generally connect with one another and stay in the same couples. And they know who their children are, who the mothers and the fathers, obviously, of their children are. But if there's conflict and if it's determined that they don't want to stay together as a family unit, separating is also not something that's looked down upon. And everyone in the community raises the children. So if a biological father were to leave and live in another household or another community and visit occasionally, that would be acceptable. And those children would have their mother, their aunts, their grandparents, as well as uncles and other male figures in the community as well to look up to. Women and the elderly and children produce most of the needed calories. Hence, there is gender and age equity in most hunting and gathering societies. So now, as we've talked about this first hunting and gathering society type, hopefully you're starting to get a sense for the fact that the way that we make a living can have a very significant impact on how we live our lives and how our society